Okay.
Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. May Allah allow us to benefit from the work of Sheikh Abdul Adras in this world and in the hereafter, and give him
Ameen.
the reward and grant him forgiveness for his efforts. So he starts with quoting an ayah of the Quran. The translator noted that ayah, firstly, but to the one who considered himself self-sufficient, you were all attention, yet the fault would not be yours if he remained unclean. As to him who comes to you with zeal and with a feeling of fear in his heart, him you ignore and busy yourself with things that are not significant. Here he says, let us, Shaykh Abdul Daras, let's reflect on these ayat and the reproach they contain, because they contain a reproach um, towards the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. The Quran here is reproaching the Prophet with regard to his dealings. Had they been the expression of Muhammad's والسلام, remorse and feelings of guilt and sorrow when he realized his mistakes, would he have spoken about himself in such a strongly reproachful manner? Would he not have preferred to keep quiet in order to maintain respect for his own views and orders? Indeed, had the Quran been the product of his own conscience, he would have suppressed some parts of it when the need arose. And had he wished to suppress any part of it, then what part would he suppress? That's the question. Well, such verses would be the first to be suppressed because they are reproaching him, correcting him, showing him uh, to be in need of correction. But the Quran is God's own revelation, and Muhammad Ali could not suppress any part of it. He does not begrudge others the secrets of what is unseen. Then Shaykh Abdullah Draz says, consider very carefully the following ayat from Surah 8, the spoil the war Surah Al-Anfal, and you will find something very peculiar about the case to which they refer. It does not behoove a prophet to take captives unless he has battled strenuously and shed blood on earth. You may desire the fleeting gains of this world, but God desires for you the life to come. God is almighty wise. Had it not been for a decree from God that had already gone forth, there would indeed have befallen you tremendous punishment on account of what you have taken. Enjoy then what you have gained as lawful and good, and remain conscious of God. God is indeed much forgiving, merciful. These ayat were revealed only after the captives in the battle of Badr were released and ransomed, and
Mm.
ransom was accepted. They start with a denunciation of this action as wrong and conclude with proving it and consoling the Prophet and his companions. Indeed, this precedent, which earned reproach, became the rule to be applied in similar cases. Had this statement been
Was
made by,
acceptable. It was
huh?
acceptable to ransom them.
Yeah,
Mm.
it is conceivable that the psychological condition which produced its beginning could produce its conclusion without any period of time to intervene between the initial rebuke and remonstration and the ultimate approval. Certainly not if we were to imagine that these two thoughts followed each other within anyone's person's soul. The later would have canceled the former. So he's going deeper. He's saying like if this was the product of the Prophet والسلام, on a psychological level, there would be some sort of contradiction here,
Mm.
right? And he says, is it conceivable that the psychological condition which produced its beginning could produce its conclusion without any period of time to intervene between the initial rebuke and remonstration and the ultimate approval? Certainly not. If we were to imagine that these two thoughts followed each other within me, one person's soul, the later would have canceled the former altogether. The final thought would have approved what was actually done. What would be the reason then for describing the thought that was cancelled and erased and recording it in such a way that implied public review? Why would the gain that was described as lawful and good be shown first to be at least undesirable? What psychologists understand from this text is that there are two entirely separate beings. One of them, the master saying to his servant, "You have done badly, but I pardon you and permit you to benefit by what you have done." If you examine these areas for which the Prophet is reproached, you are bound to conclude that they share a common denominator. When the Prophet had to choose between two options and found that neither involved anything prohibited, he would always choose what was more compassionate, more likely to win over his people to accept God's guidance, or to soften the hostility of his opponents. He would always choose the option that was less harsh and unlikely to raise doubts about divine faith. In no time with regard to these incidents did he have a clear text which he willfully disobeyed or forgetfully breached. All that he did was to consider and reflect. When he felt that he had a choice, he chose the option closer to his kind heart. All that can be said in such cases is that he exercised his discretion and made a choice. Let us suppose that his choice was mistaken. Would he not, in this case, be justified, worthy of reward? The option he chose was the best that anyone endowed with human wisdom would have chosen. The Quran only draws his attention to what is better according to divine wisdom. Do we find in this any reasonable error that requires rebuke and approach? Is
Mm.
it not a question of God speaking to his beloved servant and taking him up the road of finer education?
Mhm. So is this section still making the laying out the argument for why the Prophet ﷺ could not be the author of the Quran?
Yeah,
Because had he been the author, why would he be correcting himself?
yep.
Okay. Do you want me to read for a little bit?
Just looking something up really fast.
Okay.
So, yeah, so Sheikh Abdullah Daraz, he highlights, it's interesting because he highlights that point. But in the tafsir literature, there seems to have been some debate with regard to how to understand those ayat because they are rebuking the Prophet. So they were trying to say, like, well, they were trying to say, well, uh, how do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of these ayat?
Mm-hmm.
Because at that point in time, those people that were engaged in the battle, they were hostile enemies. And so the Prophet ﷺ had the option to annihilate them or to show them some gentleness.
Mm-hmm.
And the Prophet ﷺ showed them gentleness. That's why the idea of the two paths to take were brought up. So the debate that comes into play is that the Prophet had showed them gentleness, and but the qadr of Allah was that as they became captives or prisoners of war, that they eventually will become Muslim and will
Mm-hmm.
not be a source of danger. Right?
Right, that makes sense.
But
Because otherwise, you're just.
at face value though, but check that out. At face value, when you go back, it says it does not behoove, it's not befitting of a prophet to take captives.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, but Allah pardoned that and allowed the Prophet ﷺ to um, take that course of action where they benefited also from the spoils of war. They took captives. But, that's part of the
I,
without having to engage in bloodshed at this point.
I remember reading somewhere that the captives were also like educated. They weren't just tortured in captivity. Some people actually taught them how to read and write.
But some of them knew how to read and write, and they actually taught the believers how to read and write.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there was but the good treatment was always it has always been a principle in the deen,
Mm-hmm.
ethical treatment.
Yeah, or like that, that reflection in in the Sira about destroying what was it, Daif? And the angel Gabriel said, I think it was the angel Gabriel that said that, if you want, I can destroy the whole city. And he said, no, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because maybe their children will convert to Islam, will become Muslims someday.
But that's the ethical path of Islam. Right now, that's part of what you're seeing. Right now, and the lack of ethics. You're seeing that right now, and what's going on. war's gruesome. We're far removed from war. You see behind a TV screen and stuff like that, but war is extremely gruesome. So he says these ayats were revealed only after the captives in the battle of Badr were released and ransom was accepted. They start with a denunciation of his action is wrong and conclude with approving it. So here now is going back to the issue of the this is going to the issue of the spoils of war. It does not behoove a prophet to take captives unless he has battled strenuously and shed blood on earth. You may desire the fleeting gain of this world, but God desired for you the life to come. God is almighty wise. Had it not been for a decree from God that had already gone forth, there would indeed have befallen you a tremendous punishment on account of what you have taken. Right? These verses were revealed only after the captives in the battle of Badr were released and ransom was accepted from them. They were ransomed.
Hmm.
They start with a denunciation of ransoming as wrong and conclude with approving that the ransoming is accepted and consoling the prophet and his companions. Indeed, this precedent which earned reproach became the rule to be applied in such cases. Had this statement and the rule of how to deal with prisoners of war, had this statement been made by Muhammad himself, it is conceivable that the psychological condition which produced its beginning could produce its conclusion without any period of time to intervene between the initial rebuke and remonstration and the ultimate approval. Is it possible? Actually, that's how it should be. Is it possible? Is it
So they
conceivable
were
that it should
allowed
have?
to keep it in that instance, but moving forward, they were instructed by Allah not to
No,
do
no, no.
that.
It became allowable, right? Uh, it became allowable.
Okay, not just for that
Yeah,
period. Okay.
yeah. It became allowable. But the thing about it is, the idea here is that you have this correction taking place, and then you have an allowance. The person is being corrected, and then the person, is also being allowed to do that action that they engage in. And so I'm trying to unpack this part. If we were to imagine that these two thoughts followed each other within any one person's soul, right? They're two contradictory actions, two contradictory thoughts. The later would have canceled the former altogether. The later that's allowable, and the former is that I'm being corrected for this. So the final thought would have approved of what was done. So there's the action of what the prophet did, and then there's the ayah, which the beginning part of the ayah is correcting the prophet for what he did, and then the second part of it, or the ending of it, is approving of it. So Sheikh Abdullah Daraz is trying to use a psychological argument to prove that the Quran is not of the authorship of the Prophet.
Mm.
And he's saying that on a psychological level, if it was his own thought, that what will come to the forefront and be dominant in his mind would be just that it's an allowable action. that is an allowable action. What would be the reason then for describing the thought that was canceled and erased and recording it in such a way that implied public rebuke? If it was his thinking, why would he record that piece?
Mhm.
Why would the gain that was described as lawful and good be shown first to be at least undesirable? Right. In other words, why wouldn't he downplay? You know, like why would he downplay what he did as good to then say it is good? You get what I'm saying? Because the first part of the ayah is saying you should not have done that. It
Right.
doesn't behoove you to do that. And then the second part says that okay, but it's allowable. So then here, Sheikh Abdul Daraz injects something. Says what we gain from this reflection is that there's not one person here. There's the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and then there's Allah. What psychologists understand from this text is that they are two entirely separate beings. One of them is a master saying to his servant, "You have done badly, right? But I pardon you and permit you to benefit from what you have done." If you
Mhm.
examine these errors for which the Prophet is reproached, you are bound to conclude that they share a common denominator. When the Prophet ﷺ had to choose between two options and found that neither involved anything prohibited, he would always choose what was more compassionate, more likely to win over his people to accept God's guidance or to soften the hostility of his opponent. He would always choose the option that was less harsh and
Mhm.
unlikely to raise doubts about divine faith. And no
And
time with regard to, huh?
aren't there other instances where something is like permissible, but then the instruction is also given, like don't go to extravagance with it, or if you can't do it justly, don't do it, or
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's
like
the
it's not black and white, you know. In certain circumstances something might be okay, but don't go to the extremes in it. Like if you have to eat something haram because there's nothing else to eat, you can do so, but only until you get full and then you have to stop.
right. But here, the there's a different. I don't want to say set of conditions. I don't want to say like here the guiding values of choice, right? What guides like there's two courses of action. Here, when we go back, he says when the Prophet ﷺ had to choose between two options, two courses of action, right? And found that neither involved both of them are halal.
Hmm.
So sometimes we hear that he chose the easiest path of the
Yeah.
two. But here, saying something deeper, not just easiest, he's saying he would always choose what was more compassionate, more likely to win over his people to accept God's guidance. Not just that is easy, it's easier than this, so I'm going to choose. No, it was not only the point of was easy, because we have a hadith that talks about the Prophet picking what was more easy of the two paths, but here is giving us more nuance. What is the course of action that's going to have impact of the two courses of action that can be taken? Which one of them is going to have an impact? Which one of them is going to uh, demonstrate more compassion or move the heart or soften the blow or the air of negativity between self and the and an enemy, that type of thing. He said he would always choose the option that was less harsh and unlikely to raise doubts about faith. And so that shows that he's weighing his action, in that regard. But that's a different, you know, he's talking about that as a side point, um, because his goal is just to show Sheikh Abdullah Daraz. His goal is to show that the Quran is not the speech of the Prophet. But along the way, we learn from the Prophet والسلام, some points. Like this is an important point that we learn about the Prophet والسلام. It's a little more in depth when you start talking about decision making, not just only about what's easier, but also what's more suitable, what is more impactful, and what is aligned with certainty. You know, he says unlikely to raise doubts about the faith.
So how is asking for ransom more compassionate? Because
Well,
that's what
and
that
the
argument
other
is.
tef
I'm
and
like,
the other tafsir, or the because this can be considered kind of a tafsir. Uh, they show that those people kind of were given an opportunity to become Muslim
okay.
and receive good treatment. You know what I'm saying? As they to experience the reality of Islam, and how it is that they were being treated.
So they were offered to be Muslim, and if they chose not to, then a ransom was asked on their
So
behalf.
the ransom was asked. I mean, because you can't. No, no, not from that angle, because you can't force a person to be Muslim, but from the angle that they can see and experience the justice and the elevated values of Islam
Mm-hmm.
in the interaction. They get to see Islam at a time period where the Muslim has the upper hand. How it is that the Muslim is using that power and that set of circumstances that is hard pressing. How is the Muslim comporting himself in that situation? Is he being an oppressor? Is he showing the highest levels of regard for human dignity? That type of thing.
Yeah.
He said at no time with regard to these incidents did he have a clear text which he willfully disobeyed or forgetfully reached. All that he did was to consider and reflect. When he felt that he had a choice, he chose the option closer to his kind heart. All that can be said in such cases is that he exercised his discretion and made a choice. Let us suppose that his choice was mistaken. Would he not, in this case, be justified, worthy of reward? The option he chose was the best that anyone endowed with human wisdom would have chosen. The Quran only draws his attention to what is better according to divine wisdom. Do we find in this any reasonable error that requires rebuke and reproach? It is not a question of God speaking to his beloved servant and taking him up the road. Is it not a question of God speaking to his beloved servant and taking him up the road of finer education? That's
Mm-hmm.
the question he puts forward. Abdullah bin Ubay, the leader of the hypocrites, died, and the Prophet gave his family, والسلام, his own robe to wrap him in for the burial. He also wanted to perform the janazah prayer for him and to pray for his forgiveness. Umar objected to this, saying to the Prophet, والسلام, are you to pray for him when your Lord has forbidden you? The Prophet والسلام, said, he has not forbidden me, but has given me a choice, saying, pray that God may forgive them, or do not pray for their forgiveness. If you were to pray 70 times that they be forgiven, God will not forgive them. I will pray for him more than 70 times. And so he did. But God later revealed to him, never shall you pray over any of them that has died, and never shall you stand by his grave.
Mm.
The Prophet ﷺ didn't stop praying for any of the hypocrites. So that's another example that's shown how the Quran is coming. If it was from the Prophet ﷺ, why would it correct them like that?
Mm-hmm.
Read this story, which is highly authentic as it is related in the two Sahihs or authentic Hadith collections or anthologies of Bukhari and Muslim, and reflect on it. Does it reveal to you other than a picture of a certain servant who has taken the Quran as a course of action, studying its text to decide what steps to take? It also shows you a very kind-hearted person who feels that the first verse uh, gives him a choice between two options, and he immediately chooses the one that is full of kindness and grace. He does not resort to the other course of action until he receives a clear order. Whenever you study the Prophet's attitude, that is, in such cases or in others, you will find the two elements combined: complete submission to God and exceptional kindness that knows no limit. By
Mm-hmm.
contrast, the Quran gives the attitude that shows strength untampered by emotion, by motives and purposes. It provides a clear verdict, one which distinguishes between truth and falsehood. Whether people like it or not, it is the strength that remains unaffected by people's attitudes, whether they believe it or not. It is neither increased by people's obedience nor weakened by their disobedience. We can thus realize what gap lies between the two. It is certainly a great gulf that separates master and servant, worship and worshiper. We can stop here, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair. What do you want us to prepare for next week?
We just keep up the chapter. Keep up the chapter, inshallah.